There are some world champions who seem to arrive with trumpets, headlines, and a kind of inevitable glamour. They look like stars before they ever win anything. They speak in sharp quotes, carry themselves like leading men, and by the time they lift the trophy, the world has already decided they belong there. Denny Hulme was not that sort of champion. He was blunt, he was private, he was rugged. He looked less like a Formula One idol and more like the bloke you would find fixing a truck in a rural garage before knocking off for a day. He was nicknamed the Bear, and it fitted. Not because he was theatrical or intimidating in some calculated way, but because there was something solid, gruff, and unpolished about him. He did not chase attention. He did not seem especially interested in being adored. And yet once the helmet went on, Denny Hulme became one of the most complete racing drivers of his era. He won the Formula One World Championship. He conquered Can-Am. He raced at Indianapolis. He drove sports cars, single-seaters, touring cars, and almost anything with wheels and a purpose. He came from New Zealand, from a world a long way from the European racing establishment, and carved out a career in one of the most dangerous periods motorsport has ever known. And perhaps that is why his story matters. Because Denny Hulme was not racing's loudest champion. He was not its most flamboyant. He was not the man who wrote his own legend in bright neon. He was the quiet, hard-edged professional who let the lap time speak for him. This is the story of Denny Hulme, New Zealand's only Formula One world champion, the man they called the Bear, and one of the most underrated all-round drivers in racing history. Dennis Clyde Hulme was born on the 18th of June 1936 on New Zealand's South Island. It was a long way from Monaco, Monza, Spa, or the Nürburgring. It was not the sort of place that seemed likely to produce a Formula One world champion, but then New Zealand in that era had a habit of producing racers who were tougher than machinery they drove. Denny grew up around practical things: machines, farms, garages, trucks. His father Clive was a significant figure in his own right, a Victoria Cross recipient from the Second World War. That background mattered. Denny was not raised in a world of softness. He came from a place where you worked, repaired what broke, and got on with things. Before he was a racing driver, he was a mechanic, and that matters too, because Hulme never drove like someone detached from the machine beneath him. He understood cars. He understood what they were doing, what they could take, and what they could not. He had that old-school mechanical sympathy that seems almost impossible to teach. It was not simply about bravery, although he had plenty of that. It was more about feel. His early steps into motorsport were modest. Hill climbs, local events, the kind of racing where enthusiasm and resourcefulness mattered just as much as money. He drove at MG, then moved into faster machinery, and gradually began to stand out. But to make it in racing, especially in that period, talent in New Zealand was not enough. You had to get to Europe. Denny was selected as part of New Zealand's Drive to Europe scheme alongside George Lawton. It should have been the beginning of a great adventure for both men. Instead, it brought tragedy. Lawton was killed in a racing accident in Denmark in 1960, and Hulme was there with him at the end. It was an early and brutal lesson in what racing could take. That danger would never be far from Denny's career. It was woven into the sport itself. In the 60s and early 70s, drivers lived with death in a way that is difficult to fully understand now. Friends died, teammates died, rivals died. The circuits were beautiful, fast, and often terrifyingly unforgiving. The cars were becoming more powerful, but safety was still catching up. Every victory came against that backdrop. Hulme stayed in Europe. He worked as a mechanic. He raced when he could. He built a reputation not through glamour, but through dependability, speed, and toughness. Eventually his path crossed with Jack Brabham, another no-nonsense racer from the Southern Hemisphere, and in many ways the perfect man to recognise what Hulme had to offer. Brabham was a racer engineer, a man who understood that champions were not won through showmanship. They were won through judgment, development, consistency, and the ability to bring a car home when others broke theirs. Denny fit that world perfectly. By 1965, Denny Hulme had made his Formula One championship debut with Brabham. At first he was not the headline act. Jack was the boss, the established champion, the central figure. Hulme was the second supporting driver alongside Dan Gurney, the man expected to learn, contribute, and score when he could. But it didn't take long for people to notice that he was more than a steady number two. In 1966, Brabham produced one of the greatest achievements in Formula One history. Jack Brabham won the World Championship in a car bearing his own name, powered by the Repco Australian V8. Hulme was part of that success, finishing fourth in the championship and proving himself a reliable, fast, and increasingly formidable competitor. He stood on podiums, scored strong points, and helped Brabham secure the Constructors' Championship. Then came 1967. It's impossible to tell Denny Hulme's story without understanding how unusual his championship season was. He did not dominate in the way Jim Clark might have dominated. He did not overpower the field with raw speed every weekend. In fact, the Lotus 49, when it arrived at the Dutch Grand Prix, powered with the new Ford Cosworth DFV engine, was arguably the car that pointed towards the future. It was fast, beautifully conceived, and in Jim Clark's hands, it was devastating. But the Brabham-Repco had something else. It had balance, reliability, and race day strength. And Hulme had the temperament to use those qualities perfectly. His first championship Grand Prix victory came at Monaco in '67. Monaco is not a circuit that forgives impatience. It rewards precision, nerve, and concentration. Hulme had all three, but the race was also marked by tragedy as Lorenzo Bandini suffered the crash that would later claim his life. Hulme won, but it was the kind of victory that carried the darkness of the era within it. Later that year, Hulme won again at the Nürburgring Nordschleife. If Monaco tested patience and precision, the Nürburgring tested everything. The old circuit was long, dangerous, fast, narrow, and lined with the kind of hazards that punished even the smallest error. To win there was not to be just quick, it was to be complete. Across the season, Hulme built his title campaign through consistency. Podiums, points, strong finishes. While others had flashes of brilliance, Denny kept collecting results. At the end of the year, he was world champion, 5 points ahead of boss Jack Brabham. For some, it was a surprise. For others, it was proof that racing was not just about the most spectacular driver on the fastest lap. It was about the whole season. It was about judgment. It was about surviving the weekends when the car was not perfect and taking the opportunities when they came. Jim Clark, one of the greatest drivers who ever lived, understood that. At the final race in Mexico, Clark won while Hulme finished third and secured the title. In a gesture that said more than any speech could have, Clark invited Hulme to share the winner's laurel wreath on the podium. It was a mark of respect from one great driver to another. That moment matters because Denny never seemed entirely comfortable with the spotlight. He had won the World Championship, but he did not suddenly transform into a polished celebrity. He was still Denny, still gruff, still direct, still more at home in the paddock than in front of the microphones. Yet 1967 was not even the full measure of him, because while Hulme was fighting for the Formula One World Championship, he was also racing Can-Am in America. And in Can-Am, Denny Hulme became part of something legendary. The Canadian-American Challenge Cup was one of the wildest and most spectacular racing series ever created. The cars were big, brutal, and frighteningly powerful. There were few restrictions. Huge Chevy V8s, lightweight bodies, massive speed, and a level of engineering freedom that made Can-Am feel almost like racing without a leash. This was the world of McLaren. Bruce McLaren, another New Zealander, had founded his own team, and by the late 60s, McLaren was building some of the most dominant sports racing cars the world had ever seen. When Denny Hulme joined Bruce McLaren in Can-Am, the results became known as the Bruce and Denny Show. It is one of the great phrases in motorsport history, and it was earned. Together, Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme crushed Can-Am. The orange McLarens became icons. They were fast, beautifully prepared, and in the hands of Bruce and Denny, almost unstoppable. Hulme won the Can-Am title in '68 and again in '70, while also finishing runner-up multiple times. His record in the category remains extraordinary. In some ways, Can-Am suited him even more than Formula One. These were not delicate little machines, they were monsters. They demanded strength, mechanical understanding, and a driver who could live with enormous power without turning every lap into chaos. Hulme was perfect for them. He was brave, but not wild, aggressive, but not reckless. He could bully a car when he needed to, but he also knew how to bring it home. That was the essence of Denny Hulme. He was not simply fast, he was useful to a team. He could test, he could develop, he could race anything. He knew what mattered when the flag dropped, and he did not waste energy trying to look impressive. In 1968, Hulme moved to McLaren in Formula One as well. It was a natural fit. Two Kiwis, both deeply practical, both racers to the core. Bruce McLaren was a thinker, a constructor, a driver with vision. Denny was the hard professional alongside him. Together they helped establish McLaren as more than just a hopeful new team. They gave it credibility. That same year, McLaren took its first Formula One victory with Bruce at Spa. Denny also won Grand Prix for the team, including victories at Monza and Canada in 1968. He finished third in the World Championship that season, proving that his 67 title had not been some one-off accident of consistency. But McLaren's rise came at a terrible cost. On the 2nd of June 1970, Bruce McLaren was killed while testing the latest Can-Am car at Goodwood in Britain. He was just 32 years old. For the racing world, it was another dreadful loss. For the McLaren team, it could have been fatal. Because Bruce was not simply a driver, he was the founder, the heart, the guiding intelligence behind the whole operation. For Denny, it was personal. Bruce was a fellow Kiwi, a teammate and a friend. And Hulme was also suffering himself. That year he had badly burned his hands in a fire while practicing for the Indianapolis 500. So here he was in 1970, injured, grieving, and carrying the emotional weight of Bruce McLaren's death, while the team around him tried to continue. And they could rely on him, and he kept racing. That tells you something about the man. Not in a simplistic, heroic sense, because grief and pain are not neatly solved by courage. Denny had the ability to endure. He did not always express much. He was not a man of grand public emotion, but he kept going. He helped McLaren survive one of the most difficult moments in its history. And in Can-Am, he won the championship for a second time in that dreadful year of 1970. There is something almost unbelievable about that. Bruce McLaren dies, Hulme is recovering from serious burns, the team is mortally wounded, and still, Denny Hulme helps carry McLaren forward and wins the title in one of the fastest, most dangerous series in the world. That is why he cannot simply be judged by his Formula One stats. Yes, he was world champion. Yes, he won the 67 World Championship. He stood on 33 Formula One podiums. But those numbers, impressive as they are, still not quite capture him as a man. His greatness was broader than one championship table. He was one of the great all-rounders. At Indianapolis, he twice finished fourth in 67 and 68. For a driver coming from the Formula One and European road racing world, that is no small achievement. The Indy 500 was a different beast entirely. Different cars, different rhythm, different culture. But Denny adapted, as he always did. He raced sports cars, touring cars. He raced in Australia and New Zealand. He had the kind of career that belonged to an era when top drivers were not confined to one category. They raced because racing was what they did. If there was a competitive car and a serious event, men like Denny wanted to be in it. His later Formula One years were solid, occasionally brilliant, but increasingly shaped by the realities of age, danger, and changing motivation. He remained fast. He won again for McLaren in the early 70s, including the 1972 South African Grand Prix, the 73 Swedish Grand Prix, and his final Grand Prix in Argentina in 1974. By the end of the 74 season, he stepped away from Formula One, but not from racing entirely, but the championship that made him famous. The sport had changed. Hulme had changed too. He had seen enough death to understand what the game could cost. But he never really stopped being a racer. And for Australian and New Zealand motorsport fans, the final chapter matters more than it is sometimes given credit for. because Denny did not simply disappear after F1. He did not retire into the comfortable glow of being a former Formula One World Championship and spend the rest of his life as a ceremonial figure from another age. For a while he stepped away from the front line, but the pull of racing never really left him. By the late 70s and into the 80s, Hulme had began to reappear in touring cars. At first it was occasional, but then more serious. He raced in New Zealand endurance events including the Benson and Hedges 500 at Pukekohe, sharing cars in the old school style of long distance touring car racing. But this was not just nostalgia. Denny could still drive. In the early 80s he linked up with amateur racer Ray Smith and helped build a serious Holden Commodore Group A program in New Zealand. That car became good enough to win the New Zealand Production Car Series in 83 and 84. It was a reminder that Denny's value had never been limited to what he could do behind the wheel. He understood cars, and he could develop them. He could feel what was wrong, explain it, and improve it. That had been true at McLaren, true at Brabham, true in Can-Am, and it remained true when the machinery had roofs, doors, and a production-based shell. Then came Australia. Denny joined Frank Gardner's John Player Special Team BMW, one of the best presented and most professional touring car outfits in the country. Gardner himself was another hard-edged racer from the old school, and there was a natural fit there. The black and gold Beamers were a major part of Australian Group A racing, and Denny brought with him not just speed, but a kind of gravitas. He was a Formula One World Champion, yes, but he was not there to pose beside the car. He was there to go to work. At Bathurst in 1984, the last year under the Group C category rules, Denny raced a BMW 635 CSI for the JPS team and finished second in class. It was not a headline outright result, but Bathurst had never been only about the outright winner in those days. The mountain was full of smaller battles within the race, class fights, endurance tests, mechanical survival, and the quiet professionalism of drivers who know when to push and when to preserve the car. And Denny knew all of that better than almost most. His touring car return also took him back to Europe. In 1986, he competed in the European Touring Car Championship in a Tom Walkinshaw Racing prepared Rover. By then, Group A touring car racing had become serious international battlefield. The cars may never have looked closer to what people could buy from a showroom floor, but the racing was fierce, political, and really technical. Rover, BMW, Volvo, Ford, and others were all part of a global touring car war, fought across circuits like Monza, Donington, Hockenheim, and the Nürburgring. For Denny, returning to Europe in touring cars was almost a full circle moment. The young mechanic from New Zealand had once gone there chasing a career in single-seaters. Now he returned as a former F1 champion, a Can-Am legend, and a veteran still capable of doing a job in modern machinery. And he did more than just make up the numbers. His 1986 European campaign culminated in victory in the RAC Tourist Trophy, sharing the TWR Rover. It was Denny's fourth win in that famous event, coming 18 years after his previous Tourist Trophy victory. That is a remarkable detail, because it shows the sheer span of his career. Denny Hulme was not just a man who had a brilliant peak in the late 60s. He was still winning big races in the mid-80s in a completely different kind of car, in a completely different motorsport landscape. After that, he continued to appear in Australia in touring cars. He spent time with Bob James' Mercedes team, but then linked up with Larry Perkins in 1987 and followed Perkins into the early incarnation of the Holden racing team in 1988. That detail is easy to overlook now because HRT would later become one of the great names in Australian touring car history. But Denny was there in those early Group A years, still involved, still competing, still lending his experience to teams trying to find their way in a rapidly changing category. He also raced with Benson Hedges Racing, another Frank Gardner-run operation in the early 90s. And around the same time, in typical Denny fashion, he even became involved in truck racing. It sounds almost strange if you only know him as a Formula One World Champion, but it actually fits him perfectly. Big machines, mechanical challenge, physical racing, no fuss, no glamour required. That was Denny. And then there was Bathurst. By the time Denny arrived at Mount Panorama in the 80s and early 90s, he was no longer the young world champion from Brabham or the Can-Am king in the orange McLaren. He was older, broader, and part of a different generation. Touring car racing had changed. The cars were more complex. The teams were more corporate. The television coverage was bigger, and Bathurst had become one of the central rituals in Australian sport. But Denny still belonged there. Mount Panorama is not a place that cares what you used to be. It does not hand out respect because of old trophies. The S's, the cutting, skyline, the drop through the dipper, the long blast down Conrod Straight. The circuit asks the same question of every driver. Can you still do it? Denny Hulme could. That is why his final Bathurst appearance in 1992 carries such emotional weight. He was driving a BMW M3 in the Bathurst 1000, still competing at the front at 56 years of age, still part of the race, still in the cockpit. During the event, he suffered a heart attack at the wheel. What followed has become part of his legend. Even in that moment, he was able to slow the car down and bring it to a relatively controlled stop. He was taken to Bathurst Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. It was a shocking loss, but also one that seemed to underline something fundamental about him. Denny Hulme's life in racing did not end in a boardroom or at a tribute dinner or in the quiet distance of memory. It ended at Bathurst, in a racing car, in hot competition. There is a sadness in that, of course there is, but there is also a kind of brutal symmetry. From New Zealand hill climbs to Formula One, from Brabham to McLaren, from Monaco to the Nürburgring, from Can-Am monsters to Indianapolis, from European touring cars to Bathurst. Denny Hulme's career was not one straight line. It was a whole racing life. That later touring car period gives Hulme's story a final chapter that feels deeply connected to this part of the world. He was not a distant Formula One champion who disappeared into retirement. He remained a racer, still drawn to serious machinery, serious teams, and serious circuits. And eventually, that road led him back to Mount Panorama. Bathurst is one of those places that expose drivers. You do not fake your way around Mount Panorama. The climb, the walls, the drop, and the speed down Conrod, it is a circuit with old school consequences. In many ways, it suited the men of Hulme's generation. It was fast, dangerous, and honest. And tragically, it was there that Denny Hulme's life ended. It was a deeply sad and strangely fitting end in only one sense. Denny Hulme died in a racing car, still competing, still doing the thing that had defined so much of his life. But there is no romance in the loss itself. Racing had already taken many people from his generation, and now it had lost the bear as well. So how should we remember him? Not as a forgotten champion, because that phrase gets used too easily. Denny has not been forgotten by those who know the sport, but he has perhaps been underappreciated. He does not always appear in the same conversations as Clark, Stewart, Lauder, Senna or Prost. He was not mythologized in the same way. He did not leave behind a catalogue of poetic interviews. He was not a political operator or a global celebrity. But if you measure a driver by adaptability, toughness, mechanical understanding, consistency, and results across different types of racing, Denny Hulme belongs in very serious company. He beat Jack Brabham to a world championship while driving for Jack's own team. He won at Monaco and the Nürburgring in the same season. He became a pillar of McLaren's early years. He was part of the Bruce and Denny show, one of the most dominant perhaps partnerships in Can-Am history. He raced at Indy and finished fourth twice. He remained competitive across decades, across many categories. And perhaps most importantly, he represented a type of racing driver that barely exists now. The driver-mechanic, the practical racer, the man who could understand the machine, not as a brand platform, but as a living, vibrating, imperfect thing. Denny came from the workshop world, and he never entirely left it behind. He was not packaged, he was not polished, but goddamn, he was real. Bruce McLaren once wrote after the death of Timmy Meyer that life is measured in achievement, not in years alone. It is a line often associated with the McLaren spirit as a team, but it also fits Denny Hulme. His 56 years carried more racing life than most could imagine. The achievements were not always loud, but they were immense. Denny Hulme was not the champion who demanded attention. He was the champion who earned respect. And long after the noise faded, that respect remains. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of the Racing Chronicles. We've got plenty more stories coming your way, so stay tuned for the next chapter in racing history. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.